This session takes us to the very last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation. It not only gets a lot of attention from Christians, but also causes a lot of disagreement. Remember that this study's goal is to show different perspectives and also allow each person to walk away with an understanding of the book that is useful, regardless of personal perspective. Although Module 7 focused on the Catholic epistles, the book of Revelation stands on its own and is not considered one of the Catholic epistles. Before studying Revelation, we'll learn about a few key items that will help us better understand the book. One of them is the type of writing in Revelation. This book falls into a category called apocalyptic material. There's a very small amount of material like this in the Bible. You can find portions of apocalyptic material in the Old Testament books of Daniel and Ezekiel, and a small amount in Jesus' teaching in the Gospels. This type of material was produced when the followers of God were suffering from extreme persecution. Witnessing fellow believers die for their faith encouraged writers to emphasize that as bad as things were, God still ruled, and He would eventually defeat the evil they were suffering. It's also important to understand that the church as a whole has not always read the book of Revelation in the same way. There are many different approaches to how different groups of people have interpreted this text over time. Some people believe the book was describing events during the early church, especially the church's persecution by the Roman government. In this first approach, much of the book is believed to be talking about the persecution and the evils of the Roman government, something that could not be spoken about publicly. A much more dominant viewpoint was to see Revelation as a book written about God's ultimate victory over evil without being specific about how and when it happened. In the second approach, the focus was not on the individual descriptions or images, but the overall mood or goal of the book. The third approach was to see the book as a detailed roadmap for the future. This third approach is currently very popular. However, it is a very recent approach to reading the apocalyptic material and has only been around for a little more than 100 years, a very short time in a 2,000-year-old movement. This third viewpoint argues that Revelation provides a literal and specific history of what will happen in the end times. This short overview shows how different groups within the church read the book of Revelation in different ways. In addition, know that regardless of which one of these approaches is used, it does not impact a person's standing with God. These very different approaches to reading Revelation should encourage us to be cautious as we approach the book. The early church reflects this caution as it wrestled with including the book of Revelation in the Bible. As these early Christians talked about what books should go in the Bible, they focused on two qualities. Was it written by an apostle or a close associate of an apostle? And did the book have value for the church? In the discussion of the book of Revelation, the early church never doubted the authorship of the book, but they did wrestle with how much value it gave to the church. Because of this debate, this book was one of the last to make it into the New Testament. As we study the book of Revelation, keep in mind all three of the different interpretational approaches to the book and the concerns expressed by the early church about the book. There's one last thing we need to look at before our study of the book itself. Because of the immense popularity of Revelation, it's easy to find numerous books, movies, and discussions about it. People spend lots of time and money studying and trying to interpret this book, and much of the interest and popularity of the writing has to do with the content and style. Many people read the stories of the struggle between good and evil and automatically assume that they're the good guys in Revelation. Rarely do people consider that they may be the ones who judgment comes for. Also, compared to other books in the Bible, this book doesn't require much action from us. Compare Revelation to a small section of Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, where we're challenged to examine the presence of hate, lust, and bad motives in our lives. Or think back to the last session and the study of 1 John and loving others. Many times, our attraction to Revelation is due to its entertainment value and the fact that we're not forced to examine our lives as much as in other books of the Bible. Now that we've discussed some important issues, let's jump into our study. Revelation is the recording of a vision that John the Apostle had while in exile on an island. This vision is made up of two different parts. The first part is a short series of messages to 7 churches in Asia Minor. The second part is a vision of the end times and is full of odd descriptions, weird creatures, and a series of dramatic and destructive judgments. The part of Revelation that's easiest to understand is the first 3 chapters, written to the 7 churches. These churches receive a message from Christ evaluating them. They're not evaluated for how big, how popular, or how wealthy they are, but for how faithful the churches are to Christ and how that faith is expressed in their lives. Some of them are good, some are both good and bad, and some are just bad. We read evaluations of 4 of the 7 churches. The church at Ephesus is praised for their hard work, but Christ calls them to be more than just a church of action. They are called to be a church with actions emerging from a love of Christ. The church at Smyrna is praised for its dedication to Christ, even in the midst of persecution. The church at Sardis is severely rebuked for going through the motions of religion, and their faith is like a zombie. Although they appear to be alive, the people at Sardis are spiritually dead. The church at Philadelphia is praised. Although this persecuted group is very small, they're still very strong in expressing their faith to the world around them. The various messages to the churches gives us an opportunity to remind ourselves that our faith is not something we live out alone, but within a community of others. We, as Christians, have to examine these 7 churches and ask ourselves, where would we fit in? Which church would our church be? The remaining 19 chapters of Revelation are the ones that usually draw the most attention. You read from some of this material in chapters 6, 12, 19, 21, and 22. There's no way to avoid the amazing things described and the radical mood swings of the book. There are strange horses and riders, a destructive earthquake, an unusual dragon, and a fight with a pregnant woman whose child is suddenly rescued. The book tells of a war in heaven and then a war on earth. A woman sprouts wings and flies away as a river comes out of a dragon's mouth. It's enough to make your head spin. Recognizing that there are several ways to read the book of Revelation, one idea still comes through: judgment. The book of Revelation strongly speaks of judgment as it explains the attempts of evil forces to oppose righteousness. It continually reaffirms that there are significant and regrettable consequences for standing opposed to God. The book of Revelation is more than just a book of judgment. It's also a book of celebration and victory. In chapters 19, 21, and 22, the mood changes significantly. The ideas here are less about destruction and judgment and more about celebrating not only God's victory, but also the positive results for followers of God. There is significance in the fact that this very important message is found at the end of the Bible. Even though followers of God may see and encounter evil or be persecuted for their faith, Revelation loudly declares that God's victory over evil is certain. It's not an issue of if, but an issue of when God will conquer evil. These chapters show that as followers of Christ, we participate in that victory, and it has positive consequences in our lives. When a new heaven and earth come, the writers say that there will be a time when we will have access and fellowship with God in ways we can hardly imagine. The Bible, in the book of Revelation, ends in a way that should remind us of how it began in Genesis. God is creating a new heaven and new earth to allow Himself to commune with His creation, to commune with you, as He intended in Genesis.